Hi and welcome back to A Case for Books. Now before I even start talking about books, I need to apologise for the lighting situation in this video. I was filming this and it was rainy and then it was cloudy and then it was sunny, and I have in the end just abandoned the video to the light and whatever it would do. So this is my books of 2020, the first part of it. These are the top 10 books I read that were new to me this year but weren't released in 2020. I will have a video with my top 10 2020 releases coming up, and I'm also going to attempt to do a kind of reading stats video, which hopefully will appear at some point shortly. So without further ado, these are in order of publication, so I'm going from the oldest book up to the most recent one. So the oldest book that I read, which actually one of the last books I read in the year, was Kindred by Octavia E. Butler, which was first published in 1979. So this is obviously a very famous book, but for those of you who haven't encountered it, it is a time travel novel about a woman called Dana who finds herself being pulled backwards in time to the antebellum South, where she is kind of inextricably linked to this man who she realises is her ancestor, and she is yanked back in time every time his life is in danger, and she ends up there for different periods of time, and she goes back and forth across the course of the book, at one point even bringing her husband with her. It's obviously quite a challenging read and doesn't shy away from the horrors of slavery, but it's such a intelligent and a nuanced look at the way that we approach the suffering of others and our responsibility to it, and how when we have some distance from it we react to it differently. It's also a very, very pacey read. It is technically science fiction, it's time travel, but the time travel isn't ever explained. It's not about time travel, but it's a very tense book, both because of the kind of time travel element and when she's going to get pulled backwards and forwards, and also of course because of the content and the story that happens to her while she is in the South. It's an incredible character study. It's an incredible exploration of slavery and suffering and responsibility, and it is not hard to see why it has become such a famous and well-read book. Next up is a non-fiction book that I have had on my shelf for absolutely years and never got around to reading it, but in the depth of writing the first draft of Pages & Co. 4, I turned to it and found it a witty, incredibly encouraging book, and it's very reassuring to know that a Pulitzer Prize winning writing has a lot of the same problems that I do when writing. This is a very short non-fiction book. It's kind of like a long essay really by Annie Dillard about writing that kind of sums it up. It talks about first drafts and the blank page, and one thing I really found very comforting was she writes beautifully about dealing with the way that an idea in your head, you can never make it as kind of beautiful and as exciting on the page, and I think that's something that a lot of writers really grapple with. And she writes about it in a very comforting and articulate way, and it's just a very wise book. I would recommend it to anybody, but I think it's really a must read if you are a professional writer of any kind, especially if you write fiction. Next up is a book who, spoiler, also has a book on my top 10 of kind of 2020 releases, and that's Curtis Sittenfeld. I know so many people who just absolutely love her writing, but I had, for no particular reason, never read her before. But I got to interview her this year, obviously digitally, and so I read some of her work in preparation for that. And tangent just to say that she was amazing. I found she was very warm and smart and funny, and it was one of my favourite author interviews I've done in absolutely ages. So this prep is her debut, which came out in 2005, and it is about a girl called Lee who is, I think she's 14, 15 when she first moves from a small town to a very kind of exclusive boarding school where almost everyone who goes there is very wealthy, and she is on a scholarship. And it's this incredibly intense, personal, biting, smart, first person kind of almost feels like a diary of her experiences there, and she's so good at capturing the weirdness and intensity of being a teenage girl. Even though Lee's experiences are very foreign from mine, I found some of the kind of feelings and the way that Sittenfeld articulated them just so incredibly close to how I had felt at that time. I found it incredibly sharp, very intense, and just very unique, even though I feel like, the kind of boarding school thing is done a lot, but it's very much its own thing, and it's very clever. Although Tangent, dear me, it needs a new cover, because that cover does not do it any justice at all. Next up is the best book that I read all year, and honestly probably will end up on my sort of all-time favourite books list, but I like to kind of sit with something and make sure it's still kind of had a lasting impact. But that book is Priestdaddy by Patricia Lockwood, and if you follow me anywhere on the internet, I'm sure that this will come as no surprise. This was the first book I read in 2020, and I love it so much. It's a memoir about obviously the author, who grew up in a very eccentric Catholic family in America. And it made me cry with laughter. It made me actually cry. She's so weird on a sentence level, but in not just weird for weird's sake. And her just writing on a sentence level is, honestly, you can tell I'm being so inarticulate about it, because I just don't know how to explain quite how good she is. I would keep rereading sentences and paragraphs and just being how can you write like that? It's so weird and funny, but also heartbreaking at times. I had a religious childhood, not like this one, but a very religious childhood. And so there was also a lot of stuff about faith and your family having faith and moving away from that. And then also, of course, she becomes a writer and I'm a writer. So there's a lot of that I found very beautifully articulated and spoke to a very specific experience. But I don't think you have to have had those experiences at all to appreciate quite how good of a writer that she is. Now, apart from the very last book, which is a 2021 release, we're now into the 2019 books, which mean these are probably not very surprising choices, and they're the books that I probably would have picked last year if I got round to reading them. First up, again, not a surprising choice, is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, which I read this year because I read the whole Women's Prize shortlist. What really is there to say about this book that hasn't been said? I mean, it absolutely deserves the attention and praise that it has got, and it is so exciting to see a book like this kind of get such a kind of global reach. It's brilliant. So in case you haven't seen it, this is a book told across multiple perspectives, which is something that I particularly love always, and I think that this book is so impressive because much as there were some voices I would have loved to return to, you keep going onwards, and the momentum and the way that the story and the way that these lives are interconnected is kind of built and layered on top of each other is so clever that there's such pace to it, which I think is also so impressive for a literary novel and a kind of experimental novel, for want of a better word. It's so readable. The women whose stories it follows, you are instantly engaged with their lives and their voices, even though you spend a relatively brief amount of time with them. So yeah, in short, it is as good as everybody says it is. Next book is a YA book. It's Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. Now, I also just want to do a little tangent here to say I haven't included any middle grade. I think that as a middle grade author, it becomes quite difficult to kind of pick out favourites, and I have friends in the community, and I have books that I like and didn't like, but I just don't include middle grade at all in my kind of top 10 of the year. But I am going to put a big stack on my Instagram of middle grade I've read and enjoyed this year if you're looking for some recommendations. But I have included YA, although this is the only YA. I read Emezi's book Freshwater, was it last year or the year before, when it was on the Women's Prize shortlist, and I liked a lot about it, but it didn't quite come together for me. I read this because I was intrigued by what their voice would be like in a YA book, and I thought that this was so brilliant. It's about a girl called Jam who lives in a kind of alternate version of our world where the monsters, as it were, have been eradicated, and supposedly society is free from a lot of the ills that we suffer with in our real world. But when she brings one of her mother's paintings to life, this kind of monstrous, incredible being says that they are there to hunt monsters, and there is a kind of hidden evil. It's really playful with genre, which I liked. I like kind of fantasy in the real world, alternate versions of our world is something I enjoy, and the voice and the messages and the pace of it. It's a really, really successful YA book that I would really recommend for teens in your life or for adults. Now just a little swap around to the side of my brown paper, and the next book is by someone who I think I would now class as one of my favourite authors, one of those authors that I would read their books regardless of what they were about, and that's Helen Oyeyemi. And this is her most recent book, Gingerbread, and her collection of short stories, What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours, is one of the books that's kind of had, I would say, one of the biggest impacts on me. I would say it's one of my favourite books of the last decade probably, and so I was really excited to read this. It's a gloriously weird book, a kind of strange, dark literary fable. It's about fairy tales and family and gingerbread, but also kind of about like capitalism and class and gender. It is weird, and I think it's very much like a Marmite book. I can absolutely see that it's a kind of love it or hate it book, depending on how you find her writing style, which is quite particular. It's also got quite a high level of, I guess, what I'd class literary whimsy, and if you have a high tolerance for that, I think you would love this. But if you don't get on with things like kind of Ali Smith or Catherine M. Valente, maybe steer clear. But it's kind of surreal and dense and darkly funny and just kind of off kilter in the best possible way. I literally at no point ever really knew what was going to come next, and it's really fun to read something which is so unpredictable. And I think I just heard that she has a new book coming, if not this year but next year. I think maybe she swapped publishers, but I'm really excited to read whatever she does next. Next up is another book by an author that I already admired, and it's a collection of essays by Leslie Jamison, who wrote The Empathy Exams, which is a book of essays about female pain and empathy that has really stayed with me. That's another book that I would probably put in my books of the decade. This is her new collection, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, which is kind of hard to kind of encapsulate what they're writing about. They are about writing, but more it's about journalism specifically, and it's about observing other people, really. And she writes about time she's spent in other communities and meeting people for things that she has written, and about the process of observing other people and inviting yourself into other people's lives and the responsibility in writing about them. Her own personal experiences are also then intercut with her kind of personal anecdotes about her like personal life as well as her work, but also with anecdotes and stories about other people and other writers. And it's really an unusual collection, and it's really its own thing, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I love her style of writing. I found this collection very thought-provoking as someone who writes about people, both as a journalist and as a writer of fiction, and I just find her so clever. Like, I love reading what she thinks, basically. I don't know if that sounds a bit silly, but ultimately, I mean, what else is reading other than reading about what other people think, especially with books of essays? I would recommend this hugely to people who are journalists and writers in particular, but just anyone who's interested in people. And I would recommend her book, The Empathy Exams, to absolutely everybody. My penultimate pick is on a similar theme. It's another writer that I already liked, and it's another collection of, well, this isn't really a collection of essays, it's a non-fiction book on one subject. So the author is Doyle, and the book that I'd previously read is Trainwreck, which is a kind of exploration of women in the public eye and how they are kind of built up and torn down by the media and by society. This new book is also kind of about feminism in a very broad sense, Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers, and it's about monstrosity, specifically female monstrosity, and it looks at how society and the patriarchy is terrified of this idea of female monstrosity, but also the way that that is constructed. It's really clever because it looks at this subject through the lens of kind of popular culture and books and films. Like, it looks at horror films really intelligently. I really loved the chapter about horror films and how women are treated in that, but it also looks at kind of things like true crime podcasts and why they're particularly popular with women, and kind of coming up against things that are genuine fears and how we process those. It also looks at real history, things like kind of women who in the past were claimed to have been possessed and things like that, and why that is so sort of viscerally terrifying to people, and the way that femininity and ideas of gender kind of factor into all of that. It's such a clever book. I found it so thought-provoking. I made loads and loads of notes while I was reading it, which I don't really usually do with non-fiction unless I'm using something for research. And I just thought it was very clever, and it had a really specific point of view. Her style of writing, I think, is kind of, it's another one that I can see how people wouldn't get along with it. She's very present in the book, which I actually often don't like in non-fiction. But I didn't mind it in this, and I think it does almost feel like personal essays. It's a really nice kind of sweet spot between a personal essay and a kind of non-fiction, more academic exploration of an issue. I really liked it. I think that if the subject is of interest to you, then there's a lot to be got for this. Or if you're interested in gender or horror, kind of true crime and how that intersects with feminism, it's a really, really interesting, super readable book. My last choice is a book that is coming out next year. I'm also, goodness me, thank you for bearing with the light. Look at that reflection of the window pane. This is also the second appearance of Patricia Lockwood. It probably won't surprise you that I was a huge fan of this. This is her debut novel, No One Is Talking About This, which comes out next year. And it has a lot of what makes Priestdaddy so good in it. If you've read Priestdaddy and you enjoyed it, then I feel very confident that you will enjoy this as well. It is quite a fragmented novel. The first half of the book is weird and funny, and I don't normally go in for like kind of a crass style. Like, I didn't like The Pisces at all, and Miranda July is on the edge of what the first Bad Man was on the edge of what I would enjoy, but this is kind of like a midway point between like Ali Smith and Miranda July. Like, it's super playful with language, but it does have a kind of crass edge to it, I suppose, that she's perfectly in control of it, and it's very funny and witty. The second half of the book is absolutely heartbreaking, and I wept through the ending of it. I'm just going to do a quick content warning, so skip forward 10 seconds or so if you don't want this, but it does cover abortion and terminally ill children and the death of a child, so just to flag that if that's something that you personally avoid or like to know about in advance. It's an absolutely extraordinary book, and a lot of what I said about Priestdaddy remains true here. Like, what she does on a sentence level is truly incredible, and the way that she manages to be so funny and so heartbreaking and so insightful about people, I think it's truly incredible, and I hope that she writes I just want to read her writing constantly. So those are the best 10 books I read this year that were new to me but weren't published this year, mainly old books. Of course, that last one is published next year. I would love to know if you have read any of them, what you thought of them, and what the books were that you discovered this year that weren't brand new books. I will have my top 10 of the year hopefully up in the next few days. And I would so appreciate if you would like the video and subscribe. I also have my next bit of my bookshelf tour that I'm about to edit. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have had a lovely festive period. Do let me know what your favourite books of the year were.